there are many different aspects about CBD and the treatment of opioid use disorder that still needs to be investigated. But I think our study shows that there is indeed an importance for having placebo randomized control studies that CBD does show a signal that's worth following up on.
That's Dr. Yasmin Hurd, who will talk about her research on the use of cannabidiol as a treatment option for heroin use disorder. Her work appears in the November 2019 issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry. I'm Michael Roy, Executive Editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and this is AJP Audio. Dr. Yasmin Hurd is affiliated with the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, where she is Ward Coleman Chair of Translational Neuroscience. She is the founding director of the Addiction Institute at Mount Sinai. She's also professor in the Department of Psychiatry, in the Department of Neuroscience, and in the Department of Pharmacological Sciences. She is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and Dr. Hurd's research aims to understand how the interplay of genes and the environment affects the development of addiction and related psychiatric disorders. Her research looks at how advances in neurobiology can lay the foundations for advances in treatment. She is lead author of the lead article in our November issue, Cannabidiol for the Reduction of Cue-Induced Craving and Anxiety in Drug-Abstinent Individuals with Heroin Use Disorder, a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. Hi, Dr. Hurd, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your article begins by reviewing the breadth of the opioid crisis in the United States, which has been driven largely by the wide availability of prescription medication and the illicit use of other drugs. Medications that are currently available, like methadone and buprenorphine, work mainly by targeting the mu-opioid receptor. And these medications are subject to tight governmental regulation, as well as stigma, so there is a need to develop non-opioid therapeutic interventions. So now your team has studied the use of cannabidiol, or CBD, as a potential treatment option for patients with opioid use disorder. So first, could you talk about what prior research with CBD has shown in terms of its function as a treatment for mental illness?
Yes, CBD has been fascinating because it actually had not been studied at all in regard to clinical investigations. Very few had been done. When we started our project over 10 years ago, most of what was known about CBD was just a few studies showing that it might have some potential for anti-anxiety and anti-psychotic potential. And so a few studies had shown that it would reduce psychotic symptoms, that it could blunt some anxiety, but for the most part, the studies had, even case reports showing this potential antipsychotic properties. And importantly, they weren't seeing really, very strong adverse effects in terms of, they didn't have marked extrapyramidal symptoms that a lot of antipsychotic medications were known for. And we had been studying THC, and THC, in regard to mental disorders, we know that it exacerbates psychosis, especially in subgroups of vulnerable individuals. So it was interesting that CBD was tending to do the opposite. And that was one thing for us that was very intriguing.
Okay, well, thank you for walking us through that history. Now, your current study investigated the potential of CBD to moderate craving and anxiety in people with heroin use disorder. Why did you want to look at craving and anxiety, and how did you aim to trigger these reactions among participants?
So, when people think about addiction, especially the public, many people think that addiction is about reward. But, and that's why many of the medications today, such as those that target the mu-opioid receptor, are trying, in a way, as harm reduction in terms of replacement therapy. But for the most part, many people who suffer from substance use disorders, including those with opioid use disorders, are really sensitive to it's the cravings, that the urges that continue the drug-seeking behavior. And cues are key part of that. So cues, environmental cues, stress cues, they often trigger these aspects of craving, and the craving then leads to the relapse. So for us, the question is trying to develop medications based on the science that we have been accumulated in the community for so many years about craving, about anxiety, the stresses that triggers the memories and the craving for the drugs. So for us, craving and anxiety are two critical parts of trying to decrease craving and therefore decrease relapse and thus decrease overall deaths due to overdose, for example, with opioid use.
Okay, now one last preamble question. Your team evaluated CBD given at two different doses, one at 400 milligrams and one at 800 milligrams. How did you arrive at these amounts?
So we arrived at the doses really due to our animal studies. So in large part, we had been studying the developmental effects of cannabis, and when we studied cannabis, often in animal models, we were studying THC. And when we kept on saying all the results that we showed with, for example, adolescent exposure to THC, and it enhanced vulnerability to self-administer heroin actually in adulthood, we kept on saying it's cannabis, and I said to my team, but, we know that cannabis has over 140 cannabinoids, so let's study at least another cannabinoid. And that's when we started to study CBD. We never expected the results, really, that we saw, and our rats models, we saw that it decreased this cue-induced, once again, just like humans, in animals, if you show them cues that were associated with drugs before, that would trigger their drug-seeking behavior. And what we found was that CBD decreased that drug-seeking behavior in the animals. And we used those doses, comparable doses, from our rat studies in our human studies, because we really didn't know where to begin, since back then CBD wasn't so popular. People weren't really studying it in a manner that could give us really great insights about which doses to use. So, to be honest, we just used comparable doses where we had seen effects of CBD in the animals and just brought that in that dose range in our human studies.
Then let's get to the results of your current study. What were the main findings you and your co-authors documented?
So the first thing that we wanted to study, as we said, cue-induced craving, and we had also conducted a small pilot study before, and that's where we saw that the human subjects, they also, cannabidiol actually had helped in decreasing cue-induced anxiety. So we brought people in, and we showed them video cues and paraphernalias associated with drugs or neutral stimuli, and it was a double-blinded placebo control study. And in this way, we were able to see that people who were shown the video but had received placebo and shown the heroin cue video and not the neutral cues, they actually craved more. And they also showed increased anxiety reports. So that, and the people who have received CBD, it blunted both of those outcome variables.
And you also captured secondary outcomes, which were the effects of CBD on cognition, on general affect, and on physical reactions like heart rate and blood pressure. Were there any secondary findings that surprised you, and were there any adverse events among the study participants?
So there were some really interesting secondary outcomes. Well, first we wanted to measure things that were like the physiological measures that are objective, because at the end of the day, even though the scales that we used are well acknowledged and utilized in the field for measuring someone's subjective effects of craving and subjective effects of anxiety, they are by definition subjective. So we wanted to measure objective marks. And so we looked at heart rate, blood pressure, because often when people are craving, when they're anxious, their heart rate can go up. We measured also cortisol levels, again in relation to the cortisol, the stress that people feel in just the cues when they're craving drugs. And the interesting thing was that people shown the heroin cue but not the neutral cue. For example, their heart rate would go up and their cortisol levels would go up, and CBD decreased that. So it was not only the subjective effects of the cue-induced craving that we saw. We could see it objectively in people. And even some of the subjects that, those things, those cues are nothing, yet still their heart rate was going up, their cortisol levels were going up. So I think that it was important to have both subjective and objective measures as well. So those were important secondary findings. We didn't find that there was anything on the significant effects on cognitive performance, even though, and those are things that I think require more long-term follow-up. We didn't see adverse events that were unusual. CBD in a number of other studies now have been shown to give some aspect of perhaps diarrhea. We found mild diarrhea in a few of the participants, and some of the other effects such as headache and fatigue we found in both the placebo and the CBD group. So there wasn't any significant adverse events with CBD.
So, based on your findings, what are the main take-home messages for mental health professionals as well as for the general public?
So, our results to me provide a foundation that CBD may show, I would say, potential for helping with cue-induced craving anxiety in patients that we know are very vulnerable for craving and obviously relapse. But it's not a full, complete story that we can say CBD is a full treatment for heroin-induced craving. We need much larger clinical trials in order to be able to make such conclusions. But I think that it definitely says that CBD has both psychological and physiological effects that are important for us to continue to investigate, but we still don't know what may be the most optimal dosing regimen that must be used for eventually treating opioid use disorder. And even the delivery system, we used oral capsule. We used both oral capsule in our first pilot, and here we used oral solution in this particular study. But there are many different aspects about CBD and in the treatment of opioid use disorder that still needs to be investigated. But I think our study shows that there is indeed an importance for having placebo randomized control studies that CBD does show a signal that's worth following up on.
Finally, let's take a broader perspective. Marijuana laws are being relaxed throughout the United States. What are your thoughts on how the medical use of CBD will fit into this picture?
It's worrying to me that laws are being relaxed without actual data to support this panacea that many people start to think that marijuana can cure or treat everything, and it can't. So I do want the science and the medicine to be leading the discussions that are being had in the public and by policymakers. So for me, CBD is not cannabis, and I want significant distinction made about cannabis for recreational use, cannabis for medicinal use, and CBD that is very separate. It does not have any intoxicating effects, and it should not be put into the same bucket. It really should be unscheduled, even if it's derived from a cannabis plant, but it has no THC or anything in it. So this way we can actually conduct more clinical trials to really prove whether CBD may be effective for craving, anxiety, for psychosis, and all the other things that there are signals that it might be beneficial for. All of those clinical studies are needed, but it's tough to get those studies done when CBD is put into this big bucket that now everybody in the public thinks it's marijuana or cannabis. So I'm worried that it's going to get trivialized and it might have important medicinal value, but now it's in your water, it's in your coffee. So that kind of trivialization of CBD to me is very worrying.
Dr. Yasmin Hurd, lead author of an article in our November issue on how CBD helped individuals with heroin use disorder. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you.
This concludes this episode of AJP Audio. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to it. Please also visit our website, ajp.psychiatryonline.org, to check out trending articles, find CME courses, and watch videos highlighting some of our other articles. APA Publishing has other podcasts you can listen to. Psychiatry Unbound is the books podcast from APA Publishing. It's hosted by Dr. Laura Roberts, editor-in-chief of APA Books. Also check out From Pages to Practice, which reviews the latest research published in the journal Psychiatric Services. It's hosted by Dr. Lisa Dixon, editor-in-chief of the journal, along with Dr. Josh Beresin. You can subscribe to these podcasts on Apple, Google, Spotify, or on any of the popular platforms. Next month in AJP Audio, we'll talk with the authors of a study showing evidence that overall levels of psychopathology broadly predicted aspects of brain structure in youths. We hope you'll join us too. Thank you for listening.